Well, hopefully he's really infuriated, for want of a polite term to describe it. And the more infuriated we can get him, the better here. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be, it doesn't seem that the West or Trump can force Putin against his maximalist claims or maximalist aims to completely subjugate Ukraine.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had former British Army Colonel Hamish to Bretton-Gordon on the show. We've spoken about Russia's foreign minister calling out Europeans for trying to sway Donald Trump back on Ukraine's side. We speak about these security guarantees, whether boots on the ground from the UK is enough, whether they've got enough military personnel to offer that, and whether they would be relying on Europeans and potentially the US if Trump would commit to boots on the ground, but that's looking a little bit more unlikely. So all of that. We also speak about the fact that Ukraine has been successful in targeting oil refineries in Russia and how that has impacted fuel. There's fuel rationings going on in Russia. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcast. Hey, Mr. Bretton-Gordon, former British Army Colonel, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, the last time you and I spoke was on Saturday after this meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So much has unfolded since then as we react to this desire to get peace in Ukraine. But I want to read out a few things that have happened in the last few days. Now, we've seen Putin's foreign minister calling out European leaders for attempting to sway Trump onto Ukraine's side and holding talks this week in Washington. So Sergei Lavrov, he said that we have only seen aggressive escalation of the situation and rather clumsy attempts to change the position of the US president. We did not hear any constructive ideas from the Europeans there. So, Hamish, do you think it's rattling for Putin and his inner circle to see Trump potentially switching gears, switching teams to Ukraine right now?
Well, I think it would be funny if it wasn't so serious that somebody like Sergei Lavrov is complaining that Western leaders or European leaders are trying to, persuade Trump and are trying to, tell a story that is not real. I mean, just unbelievable. But I can see why the Russians are rattled because, until fairly recently, it would appear that President Trump and his sort of key leaders were more siding with the Russians than with the Europeans and the Ukrainians. And after the meeting in Alaska, we were all pretty sort of down in the mouth because, again, Trump greeted Putin like some long-lost friend and not the tyrannical dictator that he is. And the meeting on Monday with Zelensky and European leaders seemed to be pretty positive. Trump seemed to be more assertive and more on the European and Ukrainian side. But as we know, and as we've discussed often, Trump seems to only react to the last person he met and the last meeting that he had. And I think Lavrov, who has always been Putin's key attack dog, speaks excellent English and has been in his job for 20 years or so and is well known across the world, and always seems to be a fairly reasonable fellow. But actually, the sort of stuff coming out of his mouth this week is just classic, Russian propaganda trying to, and it's very much aimed at Trump and Hesketh and Steve Witkoff, trying to say to them, don't be fooled by these Europeans, that they are trying to make you call the shots. So not unsurprising at all. The Russians should be rattled, but of course they know that tomorrow is another day. And we know that Trump has been pretty quiet since that Monday meeting with European leaders, and not a lot seems to have happened.
So right now we know that Trump wants a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, a summit. We don't know when that would be, where it would be, potentially in the next few weeks. He would then hold a trilateral meeting with the three of them afterwards. But the main takeaway from Monday's meeting, Hamish, was, of course, this commitment to security guarantees. Trump says, yes, the US will protect Ukraine from Russian aggression, but we don't know what length they would go to. We don't know much about it. He said that's a conversation they would have after they meet with Putin. Now, you mentioned Lavrov being this attack dog. Now, he said something quite interesting in the last few days while he was in Jordan. He said that any security guarantees for Ukraine should be based upon Russia's 2022 draft accord. Now, this was a draft agreement for peace that was drawn up only a few months after the war broke out. So this proposal, Kyiv rejected back then because it basically outlined that Ukraine would declare neutrality, Ukraine's military would be capped in size and weaponry, Ukraine would make Russian the official state language, there would be security guarantees from 5 major superpowers, including Russia, except Russia would have veto power and could essentially block any military aid even if the other countries agreed to it. So basically, even if a war broke out, Russia would be a part of the superpowers involved in military aid, but they could say, hey, no, they don't want them, even if everyone voted alongside it. So it's almost comical, Hamish, that Lavrov would suggest that any future guarantees, future security for Ukraine should be modelled off this proposal.
Yeah, no, it's absolute bonkers. And it just shows the position we're in. The Russians are putting together, what they see as a peace deal that's so extreme, so unacceptable from the Ukrainians and the Europeans that it's just ridiculous. It again emphasised that Putin has absolutely no interest in peace at all. And, one just wonders what tea leaves are being read in the White House at the moment, because, we're also hearing that European military commanders are in Washington, have been in Washington this week to discuss these peace guarantees. And, one of the senior undersecretaries for the Americans is sort of reining back a little bit, going, oh, no, hang on, because we were talking about Article 5, which is where if Ukraine was attacked, the US would go all in to support it. Now, military and defense politicians and diplomats in the White House are sort of slightly reining back on this, saying this is not necessarily the case. It's all up to Europe to provide those sort of security guarantees. So we are in a really complicated and destabilizing place, I think, at the moment. And as you mentioned, Trump said on Monday, we'll have a bilateral meeting very soon with Putin and Zelensky. And of course, then the Russians bat it back, saying, well, no, we need lots of meetings with junior officials before then. So, even the thought that it will happen in the next week or so seems to be kicked very much into the long grass. And, at the same time, Trump and his team seem to be sort of focusing elsewhere. So you can see, actually, Lavrov and the Russian team seem to be playing it, a lot better, a lot more effectively than the Americans are here. So it is a big concern. That peace deal in 2022 is just ridiculous. I mean, in effect, Lavrov is saying, well, we'll take Ukraine back under control of Russia, which of course was the aim of the special military operation. Let's hope that President Trump realizes what the Russians are trying to do here. Because again, we know, and the UK MOD intelligence update 2 days ago said that, if Russia had to fight for the whole of the Donbass, and this is another maximalist requirement for the Russian peace deal to have the whole of the Donbass, it would take them 4 years and another 2 million casualties. But the Russians are going, well, we're prepared to do that. And again, that is really making the whole negotiations very, very difficult indeed. So, I'm not sure if we've progressed at all this week. We might even have gone backwards. That is in the chance of having a peace deal. The ceasefire seems to be well out of the negotiations at the moment. Trump has decided that's not a good idea. It's all about a peace deal. But again, each day that goes, the peace deal seems to get further and further away.
Well, you mentioned that you aren't so convinced that we will see a meeting between Putin and Zelensky in the next week or the next 2 weeks, Hamish. Now, Zelensky said on Wednesday that if Putin continues to ignore Trump's calls for a summit, as we know that Putin hasn't confirmed if he's willing to do it really, or no plans have been set in motion, Zelensky said that if this happens, he continues to ignore it. He wants the United States to react strongly. So, what exactly would a strong reaction entail, do you think, from the US?
Well, I think first of all, it's pretty clear that it's not going to be a strong military reaction. But it may, we've talked about sanctions a lot, and we know that the Ukrainians have had some very important strategic attacks in the last few days on the Russian oil industry, and they've cut the pipeline that was pumping oil into Slovakia and Hungary, which is a very significant attack. And anything that downgrades the Russian oil production facility, and their pictures all over social media of massive queues at petrol stations in Russia. So people are, it's actually coming home to them that they are being affected by this war. Again, what one wants is strong support from the Americans, further sanctions, keep the supply of ammunition going to Ukraine. I mean, interestingly, this week some of the Baltic states have said they're prepared to actually put boots on the ground to support Ukraine. Now that is a significant move. I think also, the British have said we'll put boots on the ground to police a ceasefire. But it may well be, as I have called for many times in the past, that European NATO countries need to be prepared to sort of put boots in the sky, as it were, to protect some of those key civilian targets, which Russia is attacking on a daily basis. Only another school was attacked by Russian drones and missiles yesterday. And Lviv, the city very close to the Polish border, was attacked heavily overnight. And yesterday there were reports of drones falling deep into Poland. So there is it seems that Russia is happy to really ramp things up. Pretty confident that the Americans certainly are not going to throw any military might behind it. But again, the realization coming out of the European military leaders in Washington at the moment is this is very much up to us. We have got to do the military heavy lifting here. The Americans aren't. So I think we're in a pretty perilous state at the moment. And as things appear to get worse, we hear very little coming out of the White House, very little positive anyway at the moment.
Well, let's get into that, Hamish, because yes, what we know is Trump, as I've said, he's committed to security guarantees, but it's very unlikely he would be committing to boots on the ground, military help. It would probably be more in the form of intelligence and potentially more aid. But what we've seen is that Keir Starmer's committed to boots on the ground to help, as you said. We've seen, and air defence, I should say. Japan, Lithuania and Sweden also said that they would help with security guarantees. But are you convinced right now that the British military have enough personnel to be physically defending Ukraine? Or do you think the UK will have to severely rely on the Europeans to help out with this?
Absolutely, yeah. Britain on its own certainly doesn't have the combat force to be able to defend Ukraine. I mean, and I don't think anybody's ever suggested that. What the UK does have is the command and control experience and assets. And UK could put a brigade in, which is up to 10,000 sort of soldiers with tanks and attack helicopters. In the assessment I've done on what's required is you probably need about 30 to 40,000 troops on the ground, boots on the ground in Ukraine to provide a credible force that could police that ceasefire. Therefore, we would look for potentially another 3 or 4 brigades, perhaps from the French, the Germans, the Dutch. We know, or we assume, that the Nordic countries who have borders with Russia will not provide troops because they are actually securing their borders at the moment. And only in the last few days, Lithuania and the other Baltic states have announced a massive increase in their defensive lines in their boundaries with Belarus and Russia. And they're committing heavily to that. So I don't think Britain can do it alone, but they can certainly put it together. And I think a lot of work has already been done. I think that's a force of, let's call it 40,000, but one must remember 40,000 troops on the ground will require 40,000 preparing to go. And in effect, once this Roermond, as it's called, goes on 40,000 who have just left. So in total, you need about 120,000 to police a force if you've got 40,000 on the ground. Britain can't do that, but it can provide a lot of the wherewithal to do it. And what we really need from the Americans is what we call the enablers, particularly the logistics support and the intelligence. And as of today, it would appear that that is what the Americans are prepared to do. But we never quite know what might be the view tomorrow.
A Russian drone fell in eastern Poland this week, I think, Hamish, and then there were fears that Russian drones were also on the Romanian border as well. So how common is it for Russian jets and bombers to be flying near NATO airspace? Or do you consider it a tactic from Moscow to be flying into NATO airspace to almost see or test how the NATO's military responses?
When it comes to Russian jets, this is very common indeed, and even coming into British airspace, flying in the Atlantic. This is a regular thing. Almost on a weekly basis, British jets scramble from bases in the UK to go and ward them off. And absolutely, Russia is testing the readiness. Now, it's a slightly different issue with attack drones, landing in Poland. Now, that is a very serious escalation. Presumably, the Poles have assumed that is an accident because, in effect, they could, that in purest terms could be seen as an attack on Poland, which would be Article 5. But what one has to be pretty circumspect. But Russia pressing NATO all of the time. And that's why it's so dangerous. The chance of a misunderstanding, misjudgment or mistake are that much higher. And I think once NATO gets into a conflict with Russia, it would be very difficult to get out of it.
You mentioned this Article 5 like protection. Now there's reports and Donald Trump said this, that Ukraine would potentially have an Article 5 like NATO protection. Now, of course, we know that one of the things that Ukraine has been asking for is a NATO membership. Russia doesn't want that. They've argued for years about that. So if it ended up being, Hamish, that Ukraine was given Article 5 like protection, it was in the written form, so it wasn't just a verbal agreement, but they were not given a NATO membership, is that enough, do you think? Do you think that they would then kind of stop, I guess, wanting a NATO membership and be okay with just the Article 5 like protection?
Well, absolutely. I think we were all discussing on Monday that the inference from what Donald Trump has said and his advisors that Ukraine would get Article 5 status but not be actually part of NATO. In a way, that would appear to satisfy all the demands of everybody. But there seems to be slightly reining back on that view coming out of the White House at the moment. And I think, certainly in the short term, Ukraine joining NATO is probably not on the cards. But again, if it gets the guarantees, then one could say it's little difference. In the longer term, who knows? I suppose the other thing to discuss is whether Ukraine would ever join the European Union, which, in effect, the European Union is a commercial and financial organisation, not a military organisation. But, morally and psychologically, if Ukraine was part of the European Union, then that would be a very different guise. But so we're not sure whether Trump's line that Article 5 would apply to Ukraine is still a line that he would say today. But I think the line coming out of European military planners and leaders in Washington this week is whether it is or not is not an issue. It's Europe who have got to provide the military protection for Ukraine, and that's the way they must go on at the moment. Because it hasn't, as you say, this has not been sort of confirmed in writing by Trump, which is probably what you need to make sure that it was cast iron.
Now, what we've seen over the last few weeks, especially in the lead up to these talks, is a lot of aggression from the Russian side on the front line. They've been pushing further because they clearly wanted incentive and to bring something to the table when they were negotiating. But what we've seen the last few days, Hamish, is we've seen a strike, a drone strike setting fire to an energy plant in Odessa. We've also seen 14 injured, including a 5-month-old in a Russian drone attack in Sumy. So there are clearly no signs of slowing down on the Russian side. But on the opposite end, Hamish, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it's not gaining as much attention as I think it is. Ukraine has quietly been successful in attacking Russia's oil refineries in, of course, conjunction to these tariffs targeting oil revenue. Now, reports have indicated that Russia's east is facing growing gasoline shortages due to Ukrainian strikes, resulting in stations having to ration fuel, drivers waiting in long lines. The Moscow Times said that Russia has lost 13% of its oil refinery capacity since early August, so just within a few weeks, as Ukraine has hit at least 7 refineries, forcing 4 of them to shut down completely. So this tactic from the Ukrainian army seems to be paying off in dividends, Hamish.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the first thing is, as you said, the Russians have stepped up their attacks. They haven't, paused at all during this time when everybody's talking about peace, really demonstrating they have absolutely no interest in peace, certainly not on the terms that are on offer at the moment. But, conversely, Ukraine is continuing with these strategically important attacks, focusing very much on the Russian oil industry, and with even, Russian media and newspapers posting pictures of vast queues of long queues to try and get petrol for their cars. This is something that the Russian state can't hide. And if people can't get fuel, we know the angst that happens in this country when we have fuel issues, how upset and cross people get here. Just imagine in Russia, they'd be, really angst by this whole piece. So I think a really clever operations by the Ukrainians, no doubt they will keep it going, because I think once the Kremlin and Putin start to have to answer questions to the rank and file, who not only are in their economy is in free fall, not only is the staple food for the rank and file of Russians is potatoes. It might be caviar in the Kremlin, but outside the Kremlin it's potatoes, which are in short supply, and if you can get them, they're incredibly expensive. But now you can't even get fuel to put in your car to go and buy those potatoes. So yeah, even the very, very long-suffering Russian public, I think, will start to get angst, which again is why the Russians are again focusing on attacking Ukraine and trying to portray the Ukrainians and the West as the aggressors and the people who are trying to do Russia wrong here. You only have to listen to Lavrov and the rubbish that's coming out of his mouth at the moment to realise quite what the Kremlin are trying to do. And obviously they're trying to make sure that their people who can't get fuel and can't get food realise that it's the West's problem, it's not a Russian problem. So it's very important that this message keeps going across to them, and I'm sure the Ukrainians will keep up their attacks, and at some time, hopefully, there will be a straw that will break the Russian camel's back.
And we know that their entire economy and revenue is tied up with this oil, but as you mentioned, residents were telling the Moscow Times that they had been giving, in eastern Russia, I should say, that they were being given ration cards, that the pumps are covered with out-of-order signs. You can still fill up in larger towns, but the lines are an hour and a half to 2 hours long. So just to end this interview, Hamish, how infuriated do you think Putin would be right now?
Well, hopefully he's really infuriated, for want of a polite term to describe it. And the more infuriated we can get him, the better here. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be, it doesn't seem that the West or Trump can force Putin against his maximalist claims or maximalist aims to completely subjugate Ukraine. It may well be it's the Russian people who are the best weapon against Putin. And, they are suffering severe hardships because of his desire to attack west into Europe again. And surely they must realise that actually their life before the 24th of February 2022 was a heck of a lot better than it is now. And, at some stage, there must be some good and true men and women in Russia who will stand up to the Kremlin and Putin and say enough is enough. Let's have a peace deal and let's get back to some sort of normality.
Hamish to Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you very much for having me.